Before we get started, hello and welcome to the show's newest patrons, Shiv, Harriet, Jennifer, and Susan. Thank you all so much for being here and for pledging your support to the show. It really means so much to me that I will be going into 2023 with the show stronger than it's ever been, all with your help, the help of previous guests, and the help of fellow sponsors and patrons. I appreciate each of you. Hello, listeners, and welcome to this mini-series on the Nawaubian Nation group led by Dwight York, also known as Malachi Z. Here to tell us about this group and their own personal experiences within is a journalist, professional storyteller, and memoirist, Jamiyla Chisholm, author of The Community. According to a 2020 census, there are almost 2 billion people in the world that associate themselves with the major religion of Islam. Today, that word often carries connotations of extremism and terrorism. It is important to note that Islam's teachings promote peace and love, and that taken out of context, with the abuse of scripture, can lead to dangerous interpretations and threatening rhetoric that is often misogynistic, homophobic, racist, and severe in nature, allowing for extremism to exist and thrive. There are messages of peace and love in all major religious teachings. However, there is also extremism in the fringes of religious groups that exist all over the world within every belief system, including within the widespread practices and teachings of Christianity. As we have explored throughout this show, spiritual abuse happens when scripture is interpreted by those in positions of power to further their own personal agenda of exploitation and the coercion of others. This often happens in smaller groups that are isolated, with individuals targeted for their economic, ethnic, social or transitional vulnerabilities. The same can be said of the group that Dwight York cultivated, that skewed and warped the peaceful teachings of Sufism, which is an offshoot, under the Islam faith, to further his own agenda, nurturing a cult of personality that would eventually lump together beliefs and teachings on ancient Egypt and UFOs, while simultaneously manipulating black individuals in the urban areas of Eastern America, people who were feeling the historical and continued mistreatment of their ethnicity, ancestry, community, and selves. In this series, Jamiyla offers us an insight into the community and York himself, how it was built, the people that became a part of it, the cultural aspects feeding into the group, and what life was like for all people who existed inside. Jamiyla does this through storytelling, her own story, but also by gathering the stories of others, as a great journalist does. In part 1, Jamiyla speaks of how her parents met and became involved with York. In part 2, Jamiyla speaks of her own time spent within this movement and the collecting of information after leaving. In part 3, Jamiyla discusses key moments in her life and how certain historical events have impacted herself and others in regards to the Muslim faith and its worldwide identity. For early access to full-length, ad-free episodes, you can sign up at patreon.com/The Cult Vault for only £1 a month. Now, here is Jamiyla. So hello, Jamiyla, and welcome to the show. Thank you so much for coming to chat with me today about your recently published book, The Community, and for being the first guest on the podcast to discuss not only Dwight York and the community, but also the first dive into the Islamic faith. Would you like to start by introducing yourself to the listeners?
Hello. Hi, Casey. Thank you so much for having me. I am Jamiyla Chisholm. I am a Brooklynite in New York City. I am a journalist, a longtime journalist. Currently, I am a storyteller with Barnard College. I lead the storytelling website for the college, and I'm also a teacher of storytelling. And I recently published my memoir called The Community in June of this year.
How did it feel becoming a published author, not just of all things journalism, but of an actual book that's now out in the world?
Exhausting is the first answer. And then surreal, honestly, because, books aren't born in a day, unfortunately. God, I wish they were. And this one took quite a bit of time for me to get through. So it was like running an ultra marathon, which I've never done. I imagine that it's intense. And it almost felt like this, like I had to keep the steam brewing inside of myself. And I really believed in this story. So it was really, really exciting when it was actually out into the world and in other people's hands.
Yeah, well, it's a beautiful book. It's obviously, as a writer, it's incredibly well written, and the cover art as well. It's really striking. I feel like if you were to sort of stride past that in the bookshop, it is one of the books that would stand out on the shelf as well. So I'm really looking forward to being able to highlight that across the month of December for the listeners as part of the monthly memoir giveaway. And you mentioned that you are a professional storyteller. So please tell the listeners what that looks like.
Well, I mean, I guess as a journalist, that's part of the job, I think, is to find stories, uplift stories, in particular, find stories that may not have a lot of traction out there or that are not popular um, on topics for a lot of people. So, what I really love to do, and I've always loved to do this, is to write about people and places and cultures, whether it be my culture that I came from or other cultures, and to find the story that can spark some kind of conversation. So professionally, what I do today, I've kind of taken a bit of a break from journalism to focus a little bit more on teaching in academia is I am hopefully teaching other people how to become storytellers. And what that looks like for me is various avenues, right? First and foremost is I would love for people to think about the unheard voices and the untold stories and get to the heart of that and find homes for them so that the masses can, you know, learn about more than themselves. And then the other part of that is people who are really interested in being storytellers or who might have a little artist hiding inside of them. I'd like to break that artist out. So, I think when I think about storytelling, right, it's one of the things that humans have done for one of the longest times um, in humanity, in addition to loving and eating and, learning new things, we also tell stories. And, of course, now we are in a society, well, a majority of the globe, we have written storytelling apparatus, right? But there used to be a time when it was just oral storytelling that you had to memorize and pass it down generation to generation. And as a writer, I'm really happy actually that I am not an orator because I think I'm not the best orator. I'd rather write.
Well, I guess I'd never considered it until you just said that, but perhaps there is an element of storytelling that takes place across this podcast. It's not just an interview setup or a conversation, but actually a journey that listeners will go through and get to go through with you today as well as a storyteller, which I'm really, really looking forward to. And I hope it will encourage a few of the listeners to head out and purchase their own copy of The Community. And this group that we're going to be talking about today is tied up in a part of the Islam faith as the overarching umbrella that is Sufism, or is it Sufism?
Sufism. I guess you can
Sufism.
say Sufism, but I think most people who speak Arabic will say Sufism. But yes, this was the Ansaru Allah community, which was the official name of it and the community for short. We did practice a form of Sufi Islam, but I do want to say that I would not call it the traditional form of Islam. You know, it was a maybe a rendition or a page swiped from a book kind of situation. So there were lots of different kinds of teachings brought into this group.
It felt as if York, the leader, took influences from many different things, threw them all at a wall to see what would stick. And so there's a lot of influences there from like the New Age movement and the human potential movement. It's not just things that you would find within Sufism, I suppose.
Or just Islam writ large. I think a lot of when I think about Islam as a religion, it is very much a peaceful practicing sort of religion. I mean, just the way folks introduce themselves, assalamu alaikum and wa alaikum salam, it's like peace be unto you. That's the greeting of how people interact with each other. So Islam, when I think about it, as a religion, it is a very devotional kind of practice. It is also one that requires a lot of internal reflection. I think, right, like that's where the idea of jihad comes from, which is that a person takes internal stock of themselves and kind of shake themselves up to find a higher truth. And so with the community, there were some, there were very communal aspects of the teachings that York disseminated, but then there were some other teachings, pieces of it that I would absolutely say were not Islamic in tradition at all, such as the separation of families. That is extremely antithetical to the practice of Islam.
Would you say that during your family's involvement with the community that you were practicing Muslims?
I would say that we were sort of practicing Muslims. Yeah, and the reason why I say that is because York, I don't think was a real imam, someone who actually went through the rites of passage to be indoctrinated as a theologian or a religious scholar or a religious leader. I think he had a lot of other skills, but I don't think that it was that he went through that process. So to have not gone through that process, could he actually be a teacher of Islam, right? That's kind of my questioning around this. And as a result, who were his disciples or his followers, were we actually learning traditional Islam? Well, we were learning pieces of it, right? So I guess maybe, in our hearts, we could have said that we were Muslims, right? But I think that's a tricky question. I've actually kind of never grappled with that. What makes one real?
Absolutely. And I think that was clear in your writing as well. I thought it would just be interesting to gain your perspective on whether you'd been exposed to other types of Islamic faith-based movements, because as like with Christianity, when you say Islam, it's one of the major religious belief systems that we have in the world, one of perhaps 6 of the biggest faith-based movements, and within the umbrella of Islam there are branches and sects and various different chapters. So when you go down one of those, you get to Sufism underneath the kind of banner of Islam. So I guess I wondered whether you'd experienced other types of Islam faith, to know whether your family were practicing what would be considered a traditional version, or whether, because this was your only exposure to an Islamic faith, you assumed that this was, of course, the correct and true and proper way to practice as a Muslim.
I did think that what we were practicing when I was younger, but that was Islam, the true practice of it. Until I got older, I'll say around my teenage years, and I was just curious on my own um, about, well, what exactly does this religion look like on my own? Not someone introducing it to me, but me going and find out for myself. So I had this minor period and during my teenage years where I was kind of like hopping around through God houses, so to speak. And in New York, the Upper East Side, there's a really, really big, long-standing mosque that has been in this city. It's sort of like a fixture. It's really beautiful. It's been here for decades. And I would visit a couple times to just see, what it was like. And that was sort of how I figured out, like, oh, there are different things here. The practices are not really what we were practicing wasn't necessarily aligned with how traditional Muslims practice their faith. But interestingly enough, when when people ask me about my background, or sometimes, or they say, "Oh, the name Jamiyla, it's a Muslim name," and I say, "Yes, I know," and they go, "Where are you Muslim?" And I say, I grew up practicing Islam. So deep in my heart, I claim it as, my childhood foundation, whether it was a real foundation or not. I just really think the religion is beautiful. Yeah.
You've mentioned that there is a presence in the Upper East Side that's quite significant of people that are practicing the Muslim faith. So what does the demographic look like overall in America in terms of people practicing various different types of Islam-based movements?
All kinds of different people. Of course, we have in the United States a really large first generation, or multi-generational um, um, citizenry here. We also have, like, immigrants who have just arrived. Um, I feel like Islam in this country has been practiced for an extremely long time, whether that be from people who brought it over from the Middle East, right, or Northern Africa, or I want to say I think it was the 50s, the 40s, or the 50s, when the Nation of Islam in Chicago, um, uh, they were founded, and that was predominantly African American, that group. And their, I want to say, version of Islam was obviously a little bit tweaked also, because it was, uh, how do I say, revised for the Black American experience. So there was a lot of nationalism that was in there. And currently today, I mean, in 2022, so many kinds of different people practice Islam in this country. Like, again, whether I say they come from South Asia, Northern Africa, or anywhere on the continent. There are, like I said, Black people in America who still practice. There's a large group in Chicago still because of the Nation of Islam, which still stands. There's a really large group in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Yeah, I mean, Muslims are everywhere in this country, and the demographic is a huge swath of global citizens. They're everywhere and from anywhere.
Wow, that's fascinating. Of course, when you think of America, you think of the Christian faith. It's having a big moment over there at the moment as well. So it's interesting for me to gain your insight as somebody that grew up aside from Christianity in a different faith-based movement, to offer that perspective and insight that I wasn't privy to. So thank you for sharing that. And also, I spoke to somebody previously on the show who addressed themselves as Black. And I said to her, would that be the correct terminology for me to use? And she said, always ask people what they would prefer. So you've used that terminology. Would you say it's fair for me to assume that that's what you would prefer me to use?
Yes, yes. I use the term Black. We have gone through a lot of terminology transformations here in the US. And Black is a term that came out of the Black Power movement in the 60s and the 70s. I'm a 70s baby. And it is a term that I feel very strongly about. You know, there are all these different political reasons for why people choose the identifying terminology that they choose, but uh, Black, which used to be considered derogatory, is now sort of, I think, a privilege. So yes, you can call me a Black woman. That's fine.
So as a Black woman, I thought it was quite interesting that there was a significant presence of Black people within America that were practicing Muslims, because I don't know if I would have drawn that connection had I not read your book, knowing that you yourself were a Black woman.
I think because when I think about sort of like a foundational aspect of Islam, a lot of it is about brotherhood and communing with your family and your people and forming alliances so that you can reach your highest high, whatever that is for a person individually. And I think for a lot of Black people in America, especially during the 60s, or during the tumultuous civil rights period of this country, that the concept of brotherhood was a very strong theme. I think whether people were Christian, because Martin Luther King Jr. preached a lot about the brotherhood, and Muslims preach a lot about the brotherhood and the sisterhood of society as a whole. And I think that that's something that is really attractive to Black people, because there could be so much that comes at us from different forces in this country, that the need and the desire to see each other in a higher light than what we have been taught. I think that is one of the things that makes Islam really appealing, because it's a very, again, I just keep saying this, a very loving religion. And the idea, again, of having a brotherhood, I think, is the thing that a lot of Black people said, we need that, we want that. And I do want to stress this also, that not just a brotherhood within the Black community, but we have this larger global brotherhood, right? Like I said, from Muslims who come from all over the world. And the idea of being a Muslim is that if one Muslim is all Muslims, kind of, we are all in this together, which is a thing that I don't, and I don't want to speak negatively about Christianity, because I really don't know very much about it. But just looking at what is happening in the United States, I feel like there's a lot of crosstalk, maybe, or misunderstandings of various different Christian sects. Whereas I feel that in Islam, it's not so divided. And I think that is by design.
Well, thank you for helping me to gain a better understanding of the umbrella itself, and the Muslim community and how it stands in America as well, because as I said before, we really haven't done. We did one interview with our friend of the show T, who was involved with a Sufi offshoot, or as you said, sort of like ripping a page out of a book type of group down in Carbondale that's still active with a pretty aggressive, abusive leader, as far as I'm aware. And that's really all that we've talked about in terms of an offshoot of the Islamic faith. But T stressed in his interview how beautiful and attractive the faith was to him because of some of the practices that you've mentioned so far. So now that we've got all of that sort of overview out of the way, which I just kind of wanted to pick your brains for my own education more than anything, we can really dive into the storytelling part of the interview now. So I am going to ask you if you can tell the listeners the official name of the group and give us a brief summary and history of the group and its leader. And I'm going to just sit here and let you paint that whole picture for everybody.
The name of the group that I write about in my book was called Ansarul Allah Community. The group became something else after my tenure. I guess that's the right word with it. But it was probably founded around 1974, somewhere between 72 and 74, in New York City, in Brooklyn, in a community called Bushwick. And Dwight York was the founder of the community, as we called it for short. And he basically established this 100-person plus community of Black people who he basically taught how to become disciplined Muslims. And my family moved in to the community in 1978. I was 2 years old at the time, and it was my father who had located the community. And the way he found it, and the way a lot of people found it actually, was that York would publish these really glossy, like magazine style books. And he would have, his version of teachings inside of there. And there would always be these different versions of himself in there, looking godly and haloed and, very priestly. And he would have these men who would take to the streets, and they would take to the subways, and they would peddle his teachings. They would sell them to people along with some other things like incense and oils. And that's how, and he also taught classes. He built a mosque down in Bushwick. So he would also hold classes there. So, he had different avenues, different ways that he was able to disseminate his teachings and to gain followers. So that's how my father found out about it. And he started taking classes down at the community. And then one day decided, or maybe it wasn't one day, maybe he'd been thinking about this for some time, but he said that he wanted to move in, and he thought that we all meaning him, my mom, and myself, that we should move into this place because it was beautiful, it was all Black, it was self-reliant, and it was disciplined. So that's what we did. We moved in. And the community, I think it was around the late 80s, maybe, or early 90s when it fell apart. There is a time break that I'm unsure about when the community left New York City and moved upstate New York, and the teachings shifted to something totally different. And then in the early 90s, they moved to Georgia. And that's when the teachings shifted again. So for the community, I think maybe from, I want to say, early mid 70s to possibly the late 80s, it was in existence in New York City. And during that time, York became a very well-known figure. He acquired a lot of interest in the hip hop community. He acquired, obviously, a lot of interest within the Black community in New York City. And I think his teachings were interesting and popular because it spoke to a void that a lot of Black folks were not getting, which was love, attention, protection, and being told that we are actually great people. You know, we're not just criminals or idiots. You know, whatever we were being told around the 70s, which was the tail end of the Black nationalist movement in this country. And that is the thing that I think York was very smart, whether I agree with him or not, to pick up on, was that he saw this movement dying and he picked up the mantle and he relit it through his own version of Islam.
So who was Dwight York? Who was he before he founded this movement? Do we know any of that stuff?
There's been a lot of literature out there about him. I don't know a lot about him before he became quote unquote Imam Isa. I know that he is US born. I know that he had a musical background before he became a philosopher or, you know, a religious teacher. The rumor was that he was a calypso singer and that he had a really beautiful voice. That's what a lot of people said, that he made really beautiful music. That's all I know, is that he was apparently a really charismatic figure who used his charisma to become this otherworldly figure. So yeah, there's very little out there about him. I don't think he was a man of interviews because, like I said, he wrote his own literature. So, you know, he controlled his own narrative, and the narrative was, I am a godlike figure. So, yeah, there's so very little out there about him. And York he has a lot of children, but they're also, a lot of them are very tight-lipped about who he was and their own history. And it might be that they may not know, to be honest with you, because I think he worked, I think his mode of operation was smoke and mirrors. And I think a lot of cult leaders are like that. You know, it's really important, I think, for them to remain mysterious.
I think you're right there. And that's something that has been commonly spoken about across various interviews. Do you think that something that York was teaching spoke to your father on that level? Your father felt like he perhaps was missing something and he found that, or the potential to fulfill that with York?
I think so. I think I will put out a caveat that my father and I are we're not the closest, so I don't know him on a very emotional level the way I wish I did. But thinking about where the culture of Blackness was at the time and what was happening in the United States, there was a lot of anti-Blackness that was going on, whether it was in New York City or California or anywhere in between this really big, land space. There was just a lot of energy being created to keep Black people oppressed. I have no other way to put it. And I think my father, who comes from a family where he wasn't oppressed, he was the only boy out of 5 kids, right? He was kind of like a shining star in his ecosystem. And, to become this young man who now has his own family, and, I'm sure he wanted to have a family that did not feel inept or inadequate or less than. And I think he saw the teachings of York, which was Black man, you are powerful. Black man, you are smart. Black man, actually, you used to be a king. And, I think those teachings, when you might feel stepped upon or disregarded or even disenfranchised, actually, that to have this other door open up that says, oh, you can actually have a voice here, and your voice is valuable and it is wanted and warranted. I think my father said, oh, yeah, absolutely. This is what I've been waiting for. And I think at the same time, because of my parents were born in the mid 50s, mid to late 50s, that they missed the Black nationalist movement. They were too young to have joined the Black Panther Party, or too young actually to have even of their own will gone out and marched with a lot of the freedom protesters. So there was, this period, this window of opportunity that they were not a part of. They were kind of watchers, they were too young. They saw it on television, they heard the radio. So when the York movement came about, that kind of, that took all these nationalist pieces from these other movements and then through, added religion to it. I think it was very appealing to my father. And dare I say that, because the version that of teachings that York was giving was very patriarchal. I mean, how could my father say no, right? He could, the man gets to win in this situation. So he's not winning out in the world, right? He's not winning outside, but in this place, he can win. And I think that's a very attractive thing for people who really, really feel disenfranchised. And I can understand that, like on an intellectual level, I completely get what that must be like to finally be able to step into that space.
Especially if you were accustomed to being in that space when you were growing up as the kind of shining star, only boy, smothered in the love of all the women around you when you're growing up, and then going out into the world with your own family can be somewhat of a reality shock. And what was your mum's family history like? Where was she in life at this point where your father finds York and his teachings?
So my mom's family background is maybe an antipode to my father's. She's an only child. She lost her mom when she was 5 years old. She kind of effectively became this orphan who was just bounced around from one family member to another until she landed at her grandmother's, which was a very abusive situation for her. And then she left home at a very young age. I think she went out on her own when she was 15 or 16 years old, which is really young. And she effectively became her own person, or whatever that was to her. So when she met my father, when she was 15, I think that's when they met. They met in high school. And, he comes from this really big family. He has 4 sisters. She has nobody. And I think it was really, really attractive to her. And I think she saw a family that she could be a part of. It helped that they really liked her. They loved her. They took her in as one of their sisters, which was extremely helpful for when my father misbehaved, which he did quite often. That she had a support system. So I think at that time, when my father found York, my mom was newly married. She had a very young child, me. And the last thing she wanted was to be a single mom alone for no reason, you know? Uh, so I think she, in her mind, she thought, I need to do whatever I need to do to keep this family together. And so when my father, according to my mom, she doesn't use the word ultimatum, but it's an ultimatum, is he said to her, I'm going to move into this place with or without you. And well, she said, well, okay, then I guess it's with. What other choice do I have? She did not want to go. My mom at that time was a career woman. She literally used to wear what I call Hillary Clinton outfits. You know, like she had a whole closet full of pantsuits. She was very much about work and being her own woman because of the childhood that she had, right? So autonomy was really, really important to her, which is why I find it fascinating that she gave that all away for the family.
When you talk about your father convincing your mum to move into the community with him, this is in the Bushwick area. Is it in the mosque? Is it near the mosque? And is it sort of an intentional community at this point that's made up of a number of different properties near one another, or one big property?
So at this time, it was pretty well established. There were multiple buildings already. If my memory serves me, I think the community took up an entire block. So the mosque was a part of this entire system. It was a literal community. When we arrived, I know that there were a minimum of 100 people living in this space. So it was, a really, really small city, but a big community. And so much to the point that people already knew about this place. It had already acquired like some kind of notoriety in Brooklyn, and especially in Bushwick, in that neighborhood. Everyone knew who these quote unquote Muslims were because, well, they had taken over the neighborhood.
That is the end of part 1 of this mini-series on the Nuwaubian Nation led by Dwight York. To find Jamiyla's work and a copy of her book The Community, you can follow the links in the episode description. To get in touch with me, you can find me at cultvaultpodcast@gmail.com or follow me on Twitter and Instagram at cultvaultpod. I'm your speaker Casey, host of the Cult Vault podcast.